Hey, welcome back to Code Reviews. We're going to continue our journey with Spring Security by adding user roles with Spring Boot 3 and Spring Security using those Google JSON Web Tokens that we have. So let's get into the demo real quick. You can see that our GET request that runs every 3 seconds is still throwing unauthorized. What we've done in this demo is actually improve some of the error handling. So it actually tells you, hey, you're not authorized to perform this action. Check your authentication. If you try and delete a user, you get the same error. So it tells you off the bat you're not authorized. When you sign in with Google, it will do what it did before. So it loads our information. It tells us it created a new user. And then boom, our user's been updated. Now what you'll see that's different is that we have a Google user and it brings back our roles. So when you create a Google user, you become a free user and an admin. So 2 roles are added to you when the user is created. We're going to try and create a user here, which we've done. And you can see when we create a user not through Google, they're just a free user. They're not admins, they're just test users. If you try to delete, it says you do not have the appropriate roles to perform this action because it's trying to delete without actually providing any data. But when you do provide some data, you disable the user and they disappear again. So that's the front end demo. Let's go see what's happening on the back end, how we're managing roles, how that feeds into Spring Security. And yeah, let's dive in. So in this code review, our objectives are create a role entity, a roles database table, and a many-to-many relationship between roles and users with JPA. So you have users, each user has many roles, and those roles can be applied to many users. We're going to use Spring Boot to seed the database with the possible roles. So when we actually create a new database, when we start up the backend app, we need to add the set of roles that are available. We're going to do that automatically. We're going to manage user roles. So we're going to actually create a dedicated auth controller and a user service. We're finally going to start using services, which we should have done from the beginning, but for simplicity, we were putting all the logic in the controller. And we're going to explicitly manage a Google sign-in versus just the create user, which you saw. And then we're going to update our user controller. We're going to configure the backend and the front end. And then, like I said, we're going to improve the front end so that it's a little bit more user-friendly and shows more data. So, create a user role. This is very similar. Create user roles. Creating roles is very similar to how we created entities for users. So if we go to our code base, the first thing we did was create a role.java entity. And it's very simple. We create a table using JPA that's going to be called roles. We give it a primary key, an auto-generated ID, and then we create an enum type of role names. And we call it out enumerated. And it's a string type enum. This is a natural ID, so these all need to be unique. And then the max length is 60. If you look at the role names, you'll see a couple of those roles that you saw on the front end. We have a free user role, we have a subscribed user role that we're not using yet, and then you have an admin. So these are 3 of like the most common roles you might have in your web application. So this entity will create the table, and it will create a record that we can start to store. So we created the enum, we created the entity. You need a repository, right? So if you remember, we had a user repository, so now we have a role repository. We mark it as such. It's an interface that extends the JPA repository. So it brings back a role object, and the primary key is type long. And we just have one JPA query that it builds for us, which is find roles and return them by name. So when you give it an enum, use that enum to map the actual role, which will either be there or not, hence the optional. So that's how we're going to interact through the ORM with Spring Boot in the database. And then we're going to create a many-to-many relationship between user and role entities. And so this is new. So we want the user entity to be the parent and the controlling person in the relationship. So we've added a set. We want a unique set of roles to be part of the user now. So we mark it many to many, and then we create the joining table. So there's no specific thing. The table is actually being managed here. So up top we say, okay, this whole entity should be a user's entity. But because this is a many-to relationship, we need that intermediary table. We're calling it user roles. We join the user ID column, and we inverse join on the role ID. So the column will be, or the primary key is user ID role ID. And then the unique constraint is, like I said, user ID role ID. So this makes sure you only have one row that has a certain user ID and a certain role ID. And that's basically all you have to do. This is going to create a new table. It creates that many-to-many relationship. We obviously have a get roles, a getter, and a setter. And then I've created for utility a get role names, which just returns an array of the role names, which is what we show on the front end. And we'll get to that in a little bit later as we show how we improve the front end. But you saw that we have the relationship managed by the user entity and the join table. So that's going to do all the scaffolding. And we can actually see that. I'll show you. So if you open up using the Docker shortcut scripts and you log into the repo and list our tables, we've built a roles table. We had the users table already, and now we have user roles. You can describe roles, and you see it's just role ID and name. And it's tied to that enum of fixed roles that we have that we're managing. And then if you look at user roles, that intermediary table, like I said, you have a role ID, you have a user ID, and the primary key is that composite key. And there you can have that, you see that there's like a foreign key constraint here. So yeah, that's how you build the scaffolding, just with that JPA code that I added. But now we need to seed the Postgres roles table. So to add the roles, they need to be there. So how do we do that? Well, Spring can load SQL files for you if you put them in the right place and you name them the right thing. The first thing we need to do is open up the database properties file. So we go to database local properties, and we add Spring init, Spring SQL init mode. We always run it. And then we say Spring JPA defer data source initialization to true. And this just makes sure that you run the data once the table's been built. You don't want to run the data script before the schema is there because it won't work because there's a thing to import the data to. So we've updated the database properties so Spring knows to look for a data file, and you have to name it data.sql, which we've done, and you put it in the source main resources directory at the top level. So we have the SQL file, which is simply 3 inserts. Insert into roles, the name, role for user, role subscribed user, and role admin. That's all you really need to do. Just insert those values. I've added on conflict do nothing. So if they're already there and we run this, it's not going to blow up and say we can't add this and throw errors. It's just going to say it's already there. I'm going to do nothing. And the ID is going to be auto-generated. So this is how we seed the database. And again, I'll show you. So we have the roles table, roles. You select all from roles. There they are. And these got added automatically. And if you'll notice in the database properties, I actually have it set up to create drop in this branch, so that every time I kill the jar, the database is destroyed, and every time I start it up, the database is recreated, so I can test and make sure that that data .SQL file is being picked up every time. But that's how you seed the database. Now it's kind of annoying. I couldn't figure out a way to do it better. I didn't Google very hard, but this had to be called data, and it had to be at the top level. You know, this isn't a very descriptive name, and I wanted to call it something else. I wanted to store it, you know, in stored SQL.roles. Couldn't get it to get picked up automatically by Spring. I'll have to look into the properties, or if you know what to modify so that I can do more than just call it data.sql as opposed to schema.sql, which is specifically for building tables. I would love to know that. Anyway, cool. So manage user roles. So we created an auth controller. which is specific for authorization, which is kind of what we've been doing. So let's check out the auth controller. In the auth controller, we've moved the create Google user that was in the user controller to truly authentication. So we've created a new controller. It's under API v1 auth. It's sign in Google. And once again, it doesn't take anything else. It's a post, and it'll pull the JWT authentication token from the security context with the authentication that happens before this. And in my next video, we'll go in depth in this because we have to do some modifications. But for now, you get the token, and then we created a user service. So that's what's next, the user service. And the user service has a handle Google Sign-in method. It's an interface. So this is going to validate the Google JWT, create a user entity from the JWT info, then log in the existing user, re-enable a disabled user, adding back roles, or it's going to create a new user with roles. So I should add or here, and essentially that's what we do. So we have the JWT, we use that to verify the Google Auth token, nothing's changed there. It returns a user or it throws an exception. We find the role, the free user role, so we just use that find by name and we pass in the enum that we want, and this actually returns the entity for this specific role. And we do the same thing with admin role. So we just actually return those entities using the query that we had set up earlier 2 slides ago. And if those don't exist, we just error out and we log Y. Maybe we didn't load the database and that's why they're not there. We create a set of Google user roles, which is just a new fresh set of free user role and the admin user role. And then we do what we did before. We say, is this already a user? So we look for the username, which is the email, to see if there's a user there. If there is already a user, then if the user is enabled, we don't do anything. We check if they're enabled and we say, all right, we're logging in an active user. You're still active. If the user is not enabled, we set enabled as true. We add their roles back because when you're disabled, we remove your roles. We update your entity, your record in the database, and we say, hey, we re-enabled existing user. And that's how you get the custom message you see on the front end. And if you're not an existing user, we add roles to the user object we created above, and then we save and flush that user to the database and we say, hey, we created a new user. So that's the user service. It's actually doing all the work and the controller just calls it. So we went through these 3, we went through the implementation, and then in the user controller, which we moved the Google stuff from, in the delete username, we update the roles to just an empty set. So this is, you get an error because it's an immutable set that you're trying to modify, so you just set a new hash set of an empty set. And this will clear the roles in addition to marking the user enabled, disabled rather. And then it updates the database. So that's how we manage user roles, given is it a create user or not. So yeah, in the create user, new random user, we pull the free user role from the role repository using the enum, and then we set the roles for the create user to just free user, which is why you saw in the demo, when I signed in with Google, I had 2 roles, and when you created a new user, they only had the 1 role, free user. Cool. Easy peasy. So we configured the backend and the front end. So we protected the auth controller that we added in the security config.json.java, sorry. So the actuator is still permit all. The health check is always accessible. API v1 users for gets, posts, and puts requires authentication. And then API v1 auth posts requires authentication. And everything else we deny. So if we hadn't added this line, we wouldn't have actually been able to access our auth controller at all because it would have been under the deny branch. So we had to explicitly allow it. In the front end, we created auth controller endpoints. So we'll go to VS Code, and we'll go to our environment.local. And you can see in our backend controller paths, we added an auth controller. We added the create Google user method, and it has the auth sign in Google endpoint. And if you look where we use that, we updated the authentication core service. And the only change we made here was just to say, okay, use the auth controller create Google user rather than the user controller create user. So we did that. So that's how we kind of wired it all together. And then lastly, we improved the front end. So we return user roles with the user projection. So when you have get enabled users, it's now this backend user DTO, which is still the first name, the last name, the username, but we also have that role names, which is just a string of role names that you can see here. And the way we got that on the back end was we updated the user projection that we had. So we have the user projection DTO, and we added this method, I guess. So you return a set of strings, and it's called get role names. And so this maps to the front end's role names. Now, I needed something custom. I didn't want to use just get the username or get the last name. I actually wanted a custom, I wanted the data to be customized. So the target is user. You're bringing back a user object, and it calls get role names to populate this value. So if you remember from earlier in the video, I created get role names, which will actually create a map of just the names in a list or in a set, and it returns that set. So this is being called here, and that's how you get that populated. And I just updated the DTO in the back end, and then I just set up, hey, we're going to get this coming through. It's going to be a backend end user DTO, and on the view users component in the HTML, I just added the roles header, and then I added user.role names. And that's how you see this get populated. Super easy. So the roles are displayed, they come back with the user projection. And then I improved the error message handling on the front end. And that was pretty simple. It was just handling, it's just conditionals. So in the core service, when you get an error, if it's a 400 error, that means, maybe you put in the wrong name. It's like you have authentication, but it didn't work. If it's a 401, that's unauthorized, so it's check your authentication. And if you get a 403 forbidden, it's a roles issue. And so we added this to delete user, and we added those same kind of conditional catches to create user. And that's how we got a cleaner thing. And so I'll show you one other demo. If I disable myself, so I've been disabled, I'm no longer an active user. If I sign in with Google, it will say we've re-enabled an existing user. I'll pop back up, and I have my roles again. So yeah, I don't know. If you're still here, we can go through the code, but I showed you everything. So this is the README. Obviously, I need to update that. So that's done. I updated the table with roles in the front end. You saw that. I updated from user DTO to a backend user DTO. You saw that. I created the backend DTO. I renamed it. Then I added role names. You saw that. The authentication core service, I just updated user controller to auth controller. And then I added the more intelligent error handling for better error messages. And then I updated the type and get enabled users. And I just made sure to explicitly cast it to that so I could work with it. But I showed you all that. I just updated the properties here, showed you that. This is the database local properties that we needed to set up to see the database. I use create drop here instead of update just because I wanted to test and show you that the data was being loaded for us every time. The security config, I was more explicit, so now it's users that's allowable, and now auth is also allowable. So that was just making it a little bit more specific, but I've showed you that. The auth controller, it's a brand new controller, but ultimately we just brought over the create Google user from create user, and then we created a user service that we injected. The user controller, like I said, we just took out the create Google user and we took all this logic and we put it in a user service. And we added roles and we removed roles and added roles based on create and delete user. Showed you that. Updated a package name. User service, this is the interface. User service, this is the implementation. Move on through that. This is the enum class of role names. This is the role entity. I showed you that. This is the user entity where we've set up the many-to-many mapping when we added roles, and we have our little utility function that we use to format our projection the way that we want for the front end. We want to limit the amount of work the front end does. I created a role projection that I don't actually use. Here's a user projection where I've set up the get role names part of it for this immutable DTO. The role repository, we showed you that. This is how we do the find by name. This is how we find roles that we've added to the database so that we can add them to users. And then here at the bottom is just the SQL. So that's it. If you stuck around, great. Subscribe, leave a comment. Let me know if you like this, if there's other stuff you want to see. The next video is going to be adding the pre-authorized tag to our controllers and actually making sure Spring Security has access to our roles so that we can enforce protections at the role level. Thanks.